Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Fossil Friday Chats. I'm Brittany Stoneberg from the Western Science Center. With me, as always, is Gabriel Santos from the Alf Museum.
Hi, everybody. Happy Fossil Friday.
And joining us today is PhD candidate Devra Hock. Hi, Devra. It's nice to see you.
Hi there. Thank you for having me.
We're so excited to have you here. I'm so excited because the title for the talk that you're gonna give, I just laughed once you sent it to us because I was like, perfect.
Yeah, that definitely encompasses all sorts of fun bits of paleontology. I love it. So, if everybody's not familiar with Devra, you're going to be. Here's some information about her. She is a PhD candidate at the University of Nebraska Lincoln, and she also got her master's there as well. And she went to Montana State University for her undergrad. She's done fieldwork in Montana, South Dakota, and Wyoming, and she loves visiting natural history museums wherever she can. She also loves theater, woohoo, and dance, including aerial dance. So this is going to be a fun day, I think. Awesome. All right, everybody. Also, if anybody has any questions for Devra, as always, go ahead and throw them in the chat. We'll be monitoring that, and we will answer as many questions as we can when we get to the Q&A portion of the day after Devra's presentation. So, Devra, whenever you are ready, take it away.
Great. So yeah, as mentioned, I'm a PhD student at UNL. I'm studying mammalian paleoecology and specifically how traits of mammals and the composition of traits in an environment can be used to interpret and predict past biomes. I'm also very interested in science communication, especially through museums. And for fun, like she said, I do aerial fitness and dance, and I also love doing musical theater as well as normal dance. So how I got into paleontology and science, I actually was not a quote-unquote paleo kid when I was younger. The extent of my paleontology interests were Disney's Dinosaur and a little bit of The Land Before Time. And I must have watched Walking with Dinosaurs at some point because we have this magnet picture frame that has had that picture of me in that magnet frame on our fridge for a very, very long time. So we obviously watched Walking with Dinosaurs at some point. As I grew up, I actually became much more interested in science before getting into paleontology. Always loved going to museums. The Exploratorium in San Francisco is still one of my absolute favorites to this day. And like I said, I definitely didn't know dinosaurs by name or anything like that, but I did hold a you can call it unconscious or subconscious interest in geology. Now that we can look back at it, we went to caves a lot. We did mine tours in Arizona and gone to trips to the petrified forest in Arizona and the meteor crater, all throughout different ages of my growing up. So there was this subconscious interest in rocks that wasn't really tapped into until my middle school took us on an earth sciences field trip to southern Arizona in 6th grade. And this was the first time I had been formally introduced to earth sciences as their own field, as its own thing to study. And like I said, I'd always liked going to caves, and that was about it for what I knew about rocks. And this field trip really awoke something in me that sat and ruminated for about another year. And for the 7th grade science fair, I did a research paper on what radiocarbon dating was and used woolly mammoths as my main example for that paper and on the poster. And this began the descent into paleontology, and we started watching all these paleontology documentaries. So all the Nat Geo and History Channel paleo documentaries, and I was just absolutely absorbing all this information. And while I was getting more interested in paleontology, I was also in the midst of deciding where to go to high school. And before I say anything else, this will apply for the rest of my talk throughout this, is I've always been someone who knew what they wanted and knew what they wanted to do so far out in advance. I am a planner 100%. And so once I got interested in paleo, I really thought it could be something that I could see myself studying in college. And I was thinking about this when the first time I did an open house tour of the high school I ended up going to. And that first open house tour was where I met one of probably the most influential teachers I've had throughout my educational career. And that is Mrs. Smith. She was one of the biology teachers for the high school, but she was trained as a paleoanthropologist. And having her as a teacher with her background as a paleoanthropologist was really a huge game changer for me. She allowed me to cater class papers to more paleo interests, and I was able to do an independent study with her on Evo Diva, which was a really big evolutionary development topic in paleo a few years ago. And yeah, just having her as a teacher and a mentor during this high school years was absolutely invaluable. And throughout high school, I was also able to actually get out and be on paleontology dig crews. So again, remember, I like doing things way ahead of what is normally considered schedule. And so during my sophomore year in high school, we had already started looking at what colleges offered paleontology and what colleges offered paleontology classes at the undergraduate level. And so a lot of this started with looking up the people that were being featured in the paleontology documentaries that we were watching and looking up where they worked and what they studied, as well as Google searching schools that had geology or paleontology. And once we kind of had a list, I started sending out emails to paleo professors asking about the program and what the program was like for undergrads. And since then, I've realized that this is more along the lines of what you do to get into grad school, not undergrad. And this is not necessarily normal to just go into college, but I can honestly say I don't think I would be where I am right now if I hadn't done this and hadn't reached out and made those connections as early as I did. And so not everyone emailed back, but a few people did. One of them was Dr. Andy Heckert at Appalachian State, and he actually invited me to join his crew for a day since they were doing fieldwork in northern Arizona. And I did at the end of my sophomore year. And him and his crew were so, so nice and welcoming to me. And this was the first time I went out in the field and got to experience and see if I liked it, which I absolutely did. I kind of shadowed them for that day. And I learned how to plaster jackets, what to look for, how to collect fossils, all that stuff. That was really my first experience in doing paleontology. Later that summer was the first time I went to Bozeman to visit Montana State. And Montana State had been on the list of schools, and I'd actually emailed Jack Horner about the program. He was the one person from that school that I knew who he was, so I emailed him. And he emailed back, much to the surprise of anyone who's ever interacted with him when I tell them this. He's generally more of an introvert, doesn't really interact with people, but he emailed me back, and we emailed back and forth for a really long time. He sent me scientific paleo papers to read, mostly his, and I visited with him in person in Bozeman, which the very initial meeting went absolutely terrible. I think I was a little bit like starstruck, shell-shocked. He told me to go through the museum, read everything, and we went to lunch, had a bit of sense talked into me by my father, and when we went back, had a much better meeting with him. I also got to meet Mark Goodwin, who was up there working with him, and that was definitely a surprise. And I chatted with him for like 30 minutes in the dinosaur hall, which was unbelievable and really a a shock for me at 15 to be able to talk with both of these people. And after being in Bozeman, I went and did a week-long dig with Mammoth Research Foundation in South Dakota. And this is one of those paid digs. We did it for a week, and I learned amazing techniques that are kind of the foundation for what I learned going forward, both in the field and in the lab. At this time, it was the longest stretch of field work I had done, and this was really the stress test on whether I liked this stuff. And some of what I found during that week is still among the coolest fossils I've personally found. So I found part of a T-Rex jawbone, you can see up in the top right, as well as a T-Rex toe bone and part of the chevron, which is part of the tail that extends down from the vertebrae, and also helped excavate partial Triceratops skeleton, and also did prep work on a bunch of different stuff. And so after that summer, I pretty much decided I wanted to go into paleontology, and then I did want to go to Montana State. That winter, we visited Bozeman to see how a primarily Arizona girl would handle the cold. And it is definitely cold, but I did fine with it and knew I'd be able to handle it. And so that following May, I actually applied to Montana State for the fall of 2012. They had that application open, and I knew I wanted to go there, so I applied. And I was finishing up my junior year at this point, and I actually got my acceptance letter from Montana State during my finals week of my junior year. And I was kind of like, do I really need to finish them? Obviously, I did have to, but that was an interesting development there that I wasn't expecting. And while I was in Bozeman that previous winter, I met one of the other professors in the department at Montana State, Dr. Frankie Jackson, and she really immediately became a mentor for me, and asked if I would be interested in being an intern/assistant for her summer field class that she taught for an online Masters for Teachers program. And I did, and that summer I joined her and the group of teachers in Makoshika State Park, which is in eastern Montana. It's has part of the Hell Creek Formation in it. And it was really great because I was able to learn everything that the teachers were learning. So out in the field, the lectures at night, I was able to learn alongside them in addition to helping out with preparation and all that stuff to fulfill like the interns part of it. And with this, we mostly did prospecting, which is you walk around in an area and look for bits of fossils peeking out. And we mainly collected smaller fossils and surface collecting. And immediately following that, I went up to Egg Mountain with them, which is in western Montana, and jumped cruise to Dr. Devra Hock's team. And I stayed up there for 3 weeks, and we were working on an egg site quarry, as the name kind of suggests. It's a rather famous one in Montana that's been around since the 80s. We also find ribs and teeth there, and I learned different gridding techniques, learned various collecting techniques there, and this is really I got my first exposure to dinosaur eggs. And it was also really cool because I was able to meet people from the department that I knew I'd be going to in a year, and that was a really neat component of that. After graduating high school, I finally got the chance to go to the American Museum of Natural History in New York, which was really neat. Got to look at all their fossils and go through the museum, and just got to experience all their exhibits at that, which was really neat. And so during my freshman year at Montana State, I applied and got a spot on our department's group of students that went to China on an NSF International Research Grant. So it had been initially for 3 years. They had extra money, and so they went for a 4th year. I was on that 4th year, and we worked at a natural history museum in Hangzhou, which is a bit inland in China, and we studied dinosaur eggs. And so I got to work with Frankie again, And we also did field work for about a week. We visited field sites and other local museums. And this was when I first developed my first research project with another student. And we looked at the thickness and composition of a certain taxa of eggs that had some unclear characteristics in the existing literature that we were trying to clear up. And so while we were at the museum in China, we used their scanning electron microscope that lets us get pictures of the internal composition. And we brought those digital pictures back with us. And we also brought some eggshell fragments back with us to get thin sections made later on. And we were able to continue this research for the entirety of my sophomore year at MSU. And coming back from China, I went back to Egg Mountain for a second summer. I found a partial egg clutch, found lots and lots of teeth and eggshell, and I also found a lizard skull, which was really neat. And since then, a bunch of lizard and mammal skulls and fossils have also been found at Egg Mountain in more recent years. And so during my sophomore year, I got a lot of paleo electives all in 1 year. So I was able to take paleontology lab techniques, dinosaur paleontology, invertebrate paleontology, and vertebrate paleontology between the fall and spring. And in paleo lab techs, we got to prep a jacket from the museum for the entirety of the semester with a group. So we learned how to do prep work with various tools, and we also learned molding and casting, and how to draw and stipple. So we learned a bunch of different techniques. And up there on the top of the slide, you can see the egg clutch that I had found earlier that year from Egg Mountain, kind of when it started and a bit more prepped as well. And so during this year, we also continued, like I said, working on our egg research. We had submitted an undergraduate research grant to get funding for thin sections, which we had received and sent the samples out for processing at this point. And so we presented on some preliminary results at both the department research colloquium and the school's research fair. And this was the first poster that I had presented on, the first research that I presented on outside of class projects. And unfortunately, this specific project kind of ended here, but it was still a super valuable and really cool research project that I was a part of. One of the other great things that Montana State had for paleo students is a separate field class just for paleontology. So while it did incorporate some geology, we mainly focused on paleontology fieldwork. And so the first week, we went to multiple different sites as a group, doing surface collecting and some data collection. And then the second week, we were split into groups and got to pick one of the locations that we did more of an in-depth, full review of that site during the second week. And we also collected a Eocene horse longbone, or a couple of them, for the Idaho Natural History Museum, because one of our PhD students at the time had been working with the Idaho Museum, and that was probably the first time I had ever done anything with mammals, so kind of a precursor of what to come. During the fall of my junior year, I started an internship at the Museum of the Rockies in Bozeman that was both prep work and research. For the prep work, I got to see what was in essentially a mystery jacket from one of the field camps in the 80s that the museum used to take out. And all it had was the year it was from and kind of the formation where it was found in. And so you can see the preparation progression of around a year overall work that I did of a Triceratops occipital condyle, which is the ball that connects the top of the spine to the back of the skull. And so I worked on that off and on for about a year to get that prepped. And so at this point is where my interest really shifted and set me down the path of paleoecology, which is where I am now. So my family lives in San Luis Obispo, and I used to live there with my parents as well when I was much younger, and this lake used to be always full, and we lived right by it, actually. Over the years, there's been drought in California, like most of you probably know, and in Thanksgiving of 2014, we stopped by the park where the lake is, and we found it almost empty. We could and we did hop down from the embankment where the parking lot was. We walked around on the dried lake floor, and there was tons of articulated fish skeletons, bird bones, fish skulls. I even found 2 bison bones, which would have to predate to essentially pre-European settlement. And I was taking taphonomy, which is the study of how things preserve and become fossils at the time, as an elective. And this whole thing really fascinated me, as well as it got me interested in how the change of the environment could be represented in the fossil record rather than just the animals. And so the following year, I was back visiting family, and it was absolutely, completely dry. And I was actually finding different animals on the lake floor than I had the year before. And so this really got me interested in the interactions of animals. And initially, I wanted to study that specifically to lakes, and that has morphed since then to some broader paleoecological questions and research. And so with this kind of new interest that I had, as well as this, so the spring of 2015, so during the spring of my junior year, the department announced that upper level students had the option to take 3 of these 2-day workshops that would substitute for required senior level geology class, because at the time we didn't have a teacher, to teach it. And so the fix was mainly for seniors who needed to graduate, but juniors were allowed to take that as well. And this geology class would have been the only class I would have taken in the spring of my senior year. And so literally in a matter of a few days, myself and my friends that had all started with me, we were now on track to graduate a full semester early. And so for me, this really pushed my timeline up to start thinking about graduate schools. For somebody who had always had things kind of lined up really far in advance, I suddenly felt like I didn't have a lot of time for that. And with my new interest in paleoecology, I started looking at schools and departments that featured that and sent out emails. While I was looking at schools, I visited University of Toronto, University of Cincinnati, and talked to professors there, as well as I talked with professors from University of Oregon at our annual paleontology conference. And I knew I wanted to apply to Cincinnati and Oregon. I actually stumbled upon the University of Nebraska in November of that year in 2015. I saw an ad for a graduate student position for lake research, but it was for diatoms, which once I got here, I realized that that ad was the reason that 2 of my really good friends applied here as well, and got in, and just happy coincidence there. And that ad didn't fit for me, but I did take a look at their other faculty that they had and found my now advisor, Dr. Ross Secord. I sent him an email and waited to see if he replied. And he did on like a strangely, when you look back at it, auspicious day. So as part of my museum internship, I was digitizing old paleo documentaries. And so this specific one on this day had Bob Hunt, which is an emeritus professor at UNL, and he was in it. And the documentary was talking about fossil poaching and selling. And later that day, I was TAing a class for the Honors College. I was TAing their like freshman English class, and we were talking about how we measure objects' worth. And so automatically those 2 things go together. And then when I got out of class, I had an email waiting from Ross from the University of Nebraska. So it was all just a very like coincidental day. I applied to UNL after talking back and forth with Ross, and they offered me a spot that following March. And when I visited, I really liked it here. I liked the department, I liked the town, and I decided to come here. As I mentioned, my museum internship, I was doing research as well as working in the paleontology lab, and we took this opportunity to start delving into paleoecology. So this was, I was looking at faunal turnover in the Turkana Basin and in Africa, and I was looking at that basically entirely from data from the literature. And this very first iteration of it was very rough now looking back at it, but I still got good feedback about it. I presented as a poster at our paleo conference, and I gave a talk actually at the geology conference. And I just want to say it's super important to, if you're going to go into research, to practice doing that and practice developing those ideas, because that's really the only way you can get better at it. And so as I was getting close to graduating, I reached out to the Natural History Museum in Mesa, Arizona to see if I could volunteer or even work there while I was home. They didn't have any funding, but I did volunteer with them for about 6 months, and I worked on identifying and cataloging quaternary age bones that they had absorbed from Northern Arizona University, and was cataloging them and putting them into their collections database. And so I did that, like I said, for pretty much up until I went to UNL. The summer before I started UNL, I joined Ross out in the field in Wyoming, which started my foray into mammals. It at that point been a few years since I had done any field work, and it was definitely a different style of field work, kind of a cross between quarry-based and prospecting. So we didn't have a quarry. We were still doing surface collecting, but we were in areas where there was history of fossils being there, so it wasn't entirely just see what you can find. And I went back with him now multiple times, but that the summer before my first year at UNL, my first year at UNL, I set up a research topic, got started on data collection for my master's, and I also refined and finished that research project that I had for Montana, which I again presented at SVP and GSA. And over the summer, I went out in the field again, back to Wyoming, and we found some fun stuff. The tapir jaw that's listed there, I found just because I was tired of walking around. So I sat down, and it looked like it was just a bit of turtle bone, because in the section right below us, there's a bunch of like exploded turtle. So it just looked like it was a bit of turtle, and I just started scraping at it because I didn't want to walk around anymore. And it ended up being a partial jaw of an early tapir. So that was that summer. The following year, continued up and finished my master's. I finished it, defended in June of 2018, and I graduated in that summer August ceremony, and I stayed at UNL to continue my research on mammalian traits and paleoecology for my PhD. And since then, I've been obviously working on my PhD research. Last year, we went out in the field again, and I found a couple of really cool things. I found a partial skull. So if you look at the bottom left picture, you can see like those black bits peeking up. Those are the bottom of your top teeth, and the skull's underneath the ground. That one's fun because I was in the back of the line, and everybody else had walked over it. And I was looking down at the ground and saw that, and it was like, we probably should take a look at this. And we ended up jacketing it. And then the other picture from the field, that was articulated hind limb bones. I had sat down a couple days later because it was super windy and my eyes were getting really watery. And I was starting to get back up, and I was just placing my hands on the hill to get myself back up. And I placed my hand right next to this. I almost stepped on it. And so once I could see, I realized that I had something, and cleaned it off a bit more and called Ross over. And then last year, I presented at our annual Paleo conference in Brisbane, which is where I met Gabe and first got introduced to him. earlier this year, I passed my comprehensive exams to fully become a candidate. And right now I'm working on getting my first chapter submitted to a journal as a paper and working on my next chapter as well. One last thing I want to say before we open it up to a chat is while I've been at UNL, I've been super lucky to explore my interests outside of my pure paleo research in my interests in science communication and museum and informal learning. So I took a class on communicating science through outreach, where we led a local middle school's after-school science club for that semester. And during that class, I met one of the directors at a local all-girls STEAM summer camp. And I've done programs with them now for 2 summers. Should have been a third this year, but the world decided to end. The first one I did a full week on a paleontology class, and the other I did a day of different workshops of how we can see science in the world around us. And I actually pulled one of my other aerial friends out with me, and we did an aerial physics demonstration, which was super duper fun to demonstrate physics and stuff like that. And I was also able to take at UNL a class on exhibit building, where we partnered with the Virology Center on campus to create a lobby exhibit of a renowned Nebraska virologist. And through this class, I met Dr. Judy Diamond, who encouraged me in my museum interests, and she added me to a research group she was a part of that was looking at how natural history museums teach and show science. And I went with her to meet the group in Israel last year, where we visited different museums and met with various museum educators, as well as writing a draft for a thought paper discussing the need for the nature and the process of science to be shown in museums rather than just the results to be displayed. And I've also done tons of different events with my museum here and different outreach and all of that stuff. And so I've been super lucky to be able to do both parts of my interest while I've been here. And so kind of a couple overalls before I end. It was really important to me to be able to get my hands dirty, pun intended, and try out what I was interested in. And so no matter what you're interested in, go out and try it. Try and experience it, because you won't know if you really like it until you do. And the second thing is having support while you do that is invaluable. So my family, and especially my dad, supported me in every step of the way that now that I've told you about. He joined me on some of the early digs that I went to as a high schooler. He went with me to look at schools. Like I said, just having that type of support is absolutely crucial for me and for anybody. So with that, that's the end of my prepared stuff. So I'm super excited to chat with you now. And I guess I'll just end my screen sharing.
Yep, go for it.
Okay.
Well, thanks, Devra. That was a great story.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, I just really love how it shows in your story how much it matters trying to connect and meet people, because they can that whole thing about networking really does play a big difference in getting to find these opportunities and stuff like that.
Absolutely. Like I said, if I hadn't reached out to people, I would not be where I am right now.
Yeah, so send those emails, everybody, and make those connections.
The worst that can happen is you don't get an email response back. Emailing is fairly low risk now. And honestly, the worst that can happen is they ignore you.
It's true. If you have anxiety about it too, because this happens to me a lot, where I won't do something because I get so much anxiety about not getting an answer back. But really, once that happens, it's okay, fine, I'll just email someone else. Because I know for me and Brittany too, we both started because we decided to send someone an email if we could work at a museum, and now here we are doing it as our jobs.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. Alrighty. So I have a question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Gabe.
Go ahead, Britt. I had a question too, but you can go first.
Yeah, I have a question. So going forward, in your PhD, like, are there any research questions related to paleoecology that you like want to answer that like you haven't gotten to look into yet, or things that you're like, ooh, I want to know more about that, but you just haven't had a chance to yet?
So right now, well, once I get a little bit more into it, I'm going to be looking at Miocene sites. So I'll be taking
Ooh,
I'm
all about the Miocene, so
I'll be
that's
taking
exciting.
the composition of traits and the proportion of different traits in different localities and plugging them into a model that I'm working on to interpret more of a regional biome for that area. And I'll be looking at mostly Nebraska sites using art collections here. One thing I think would be really cool to do and was possibly in the works initially when I started was doing more of a regional or continental scope of regional biomes and going to different museums and doing the same thing and getting like these different regional interpretations across the continent. But visiting places is not really a thing right now.
Yeah.
So we had to refocus and just hone down a bit, also to make it doable to do in the next 2 years.
Yeah.
But I think it just overall, like how environments change, I think is really interesting. So going forward, like that would probably be something that I'd want to return to, is looking at the same exact locality over multiple years and seeing how the traits change and how the taxa change over time at that one specific place, and see if that picks up environmental signals rather than doing this like more regional at the same time approach that I'm doing for my PhD right now.
Yeah. Out of curiosity, because I'm not super familiar with, one second, I have to plug in my computer. Out of curiosity, I'm not super, I work in the Miocene, but I'm not super familiar with Nebraska. Like, what kind of fauna are we talking about? Like, what do you find?
Lots of horses, lots of camels.
Yeah, I could guess that.
Yes. Yeah. And we do have a small like rodents and small taxa as well, some of the carnivores, but yeah, a lot of the ungulates.
Horses everywhere, all the time.
Brittany loves her horses.
I can't help it. They haunt me constantly.
I want to ask a question back on of like what we were talking about earlier about networking. So yeah, it's very important. We all know that. But how would you suggest that we can make that kind of like experience, I guess, easier for folks who may not necessarily have that capability or the access to it in the first place, right? Like a lot of it for some folks it has to do with privilege. Sometimes it's just pure luck for a lot of other folks. How can we make it a lot more equitable for folks to develop these networking skills and go from, like, for you as a high school student, which was amazing, to planning out this amazing educational career? How can other folks how do you think we can make it easier for other folks to be able to do that in paleo?
I think it's a bit of changing it from the inside out. So now that we're the ones that potentially people would be emailing, or we will be in the next few years, we have friends that people would be emailing, like now that we're in positions of like we have research positions, or we might be, that type of thing, or we will be soon, is encouraging either ourselves or other people to be more open to receiving and talking to people outside of the sciences. I think a lot of professors, if they get an email, like they either dismiss it or they'll say they'll get to it and they never do. Like it's not a super high priority for a lot of people in academia to answer emails or communicate, especially with someone who's like in high school reaching out to them. But I think that's like when a lot of people do develop their interests is in high school. And I think it's important to be able to foster that for them or encourage them to foster that. So, I mean, honestly, just like creating a more of an open environment. Like I think Twitter's really helped with making networking a bit more easygoing. Like, I follow and communicate with people on Twitter that like I either never have met or barely met before, and it's kind of this like open playing field where it's okay to comment on somebody's post if you don't know them, or it's okay, you know, that type of thing. So I think that's super crucial too, is just like opening up that, and it's kind of like removing that wall. So like I don't have, you know, a full answer. Like I think anybody, like if you have access to internet, I mean everyone has it on their phone. Like if you have access to internet, you can either have a Twitter or you can send out an email. And so like I didn't know the people I was emailing. Like I didn't come from a science family. Like my dad produces theater plays, and my mom used to be a Pilates instructor, and she did dance and theater, and now she works as a business manager. But like I didn't come from a science background, and I know for some people like that's a huge barrier when getting into the science, getting especially into grad school, is if you have parents or family that are in it, like you know what to expect, so you're better prepared for it. And that's definitely like the case, but I think it's doable to do without having that background, as long as you know, it is luck. It's finding the right people. It's the right, you know, the right people emailing back, like all of that stuff. But I think it's relatively easy now in this age of like digital communication and all that stuff to send out emails, and then just us being on the receiving ends have to follow through with being interested in people that email us and communicating with them and all that stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah. Great answer.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. There's one from the chat. This is from Sabrina, who says, "Hi, Devra. They want to know what your favorite paleo organism is." Hardest question of all.
So I have a few. So my favorite invertebrate is a trilobite.
Classic.
That stems back from the like before the Dinosaurs Discovery BBC mockumentary show, and it just like has them like shuffling along on the seafloor, and they're just like so cute. So trilobites are my favorite invertebrate. My favorite dinosaur would probably either have to be Pachyes, so not the headbang ones, but the dome-headed ones, or Spinosaurus. Even though I've never worked with them, I've had either of them actually. And then I don't really have, I guess if I'd have to say a favorite mammal, I'd probably say woolly mammoths, just because they're the ones that got me interested in paleo. But I only, like, I work with, like, all mammals right now, so I don't have, like my research is very broad in the terms of, like, I'm just looking at, like, all mammals or traits in a community, so I'm not looking at, like, what are, like, horses doing, or what are these guys doing, so I don't have, like, a favorite in that respect for my research.
Don't worry, everybody. This is a picture. This is a background. Max is not here to have heard those words about woolly mammoths. We're okay.
But I also
our poor mastodon will get over it.
But I think it's also kind of funny that I did end up at a school or the museum that we have. We have our woolly mammoth as, or maybe it might be a Colombian. But we have our mammoth as our mascot at Morrill Hall too.
Your museum sounds like it's got like really great programs there for like not just for people who attend it, but like the students too. Like between that exhibit design class you had and doing informal education to teach you, I think those are such important skills to teach future scientists as well. What was that like for you, being able to do that? Especially like you said you did a physics aerial dance class too for
yeah. So that was outside of the school.
Oh, okay.
But there's a camp here in Lincoln that's an all girls. It's like a week-long sleepaway camp that's STEAM, so STEM with arts. And my first year, was actually finishing up writing my master's while I was doing this paleo class. So I teach it in the morning, and then like the rest of the day I'd just be working on my master's, and this is the week before my defense.
Oh,
But it worked out rather well. I mean, they were super understanding about it, and like I had no other responsibilities other than teaching. That was super fun. We did like a paleo CSI thing. So I made like a little story of like which dinosaur killed which, and I got we checked out like the fossil kits from the museum, and then we also did some like molding and casting and some paleo art and stuff like that as well. And then the second year, I only did it for a day, like worked with the camp. And so I did like 3 different mini workshops. So the first one was like science and music. So we talked about like sound waves. We built like the cardboard, like guitars with the rubber bands. And then the second one was more like environmentalism, like cutting down on plastics and that type of stuff. And then the third one was, like physics in, like, basically physics around us, but I used aerial stuff. And so I did it on the Lyra, and then I had a friend who came in and undid it on the hammock, which was the fabrics. And we kind of gave an explanation, we each of us did, on, like, how centrifugal force works, how momentum works, like, vectors, like, all that stuff. And then we, like, had the kids come up and try it on the apparatus.
I love that.
So that's so fun. That's so cool.
That's so cool. It's like applied physics. They learn it while they're doing it. Plus, they get to learn a cool skill.
Yeah. And, so our department also partners with the museum a lot, and we have this yearly event called Dinosaurs and Disasters, where it's like basically the museum's biggest event, and a lot of the grad students and faculty have different activity booths and stuff like that. And so that's probably going to be virtual this year. But yeah, there's a lot of opportunities to do like science outreach here. Nice.
Talking about STEAM, art and science, right?
Yeah.
Given that your family has this theater background and that you love musical theater, would you ever want to do a musical about paleontology? Is that something you could figure out?
Probably like the most likely like set of circumstances that would fit into like a musical format would be the Bone Wars, just because like the history itself is so out there and ridiculous that like it could be. But I honestly think like I took a few museum classes at Montana, and one of the things that struck me was like kind of how similar exhibits are in like compared to sets. So like in terms of loading them in and getting them set up, like you normally only have like a day or two to load them in. Like you have to put everything together and all that stuff. So I mean, there are definitely other similarities as well.
Oh yeah. Brittany and I know all too well about exhibit setup and limited time.
Yes. Oh my goodness. Every outreach booth we've ever had to put together. My goodness.
There was one outreach booth where I don't remember what happened, Britt, but we were like not late, but we only had like 10 minutes to set up. Was that like longer than Comic-Con?
It might have been. That was intense.
Yeah, and so we had 10 minutes to set up a full exhibit booth, and so we're like, okay, let's do this. So we're just throwing stuff on the table. I'm like feeling like a director, like we got it, we have live in 10 minutes, action, let's go.
Yeah, like, and also like when I had that exhibits class here, like it was actually mostly like graphic designers and journalists that were taking it. There was myself and another anthro grad student who are the more science people other than the professors. And my head like almost exploded every single class, like having to cross manage like right and left side of the brain, and like interacting with like creative people and especially graphic designers. Like interacting with them is so different than interacting with scientists, like in terms of giving like feedback or comments or anything like that. So I mean, that was super useful, like, and all that stuff, but it was also like having to use part of my brain like I don't normally use was very strenuous.
I will say to everyone who is watching, if you're a student, like take the time to learn graphic design, like even at a very basic level, like just go on YouTube and type in like how to make a poster or something, because it's a skill that will help you in so many ways down the line, from making better posters, because some people make ugly posters, just saying. But like it's gonna help in all things, making figures, science communication stuff. Just go online and learn about it.
I use Illustrator. I use Illustrator like all the time to edit my figures. Like I'll make like a base one in whatever stats program I'm using, and then I'll open it up in Illustrator and tinker with it and change the size and make it pretty. Like absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's really fun.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Like editing
like
figures is like my like, I don't want to say my therapy, but like is like my pseudo like calm time, because like it's productive. Like I have to do it, but I also like don't have to super think about it. Like it's not that stressful. Like I can just like spend an afternoon like editing or creating figures, and it's great.
Yeah. Like when I was finishing my master's, every time I got to work on figures instead of writing, actually, it was great, because I was like, man, writing is hard. I'm just going to make this figure so much more pretty. That's how I ended up with like these beautiful graphics and stuff. It was awesome.
Yeah. Oh, man. Well, thank you so much, Devra. That looks like all of our questions. Thank you again for joining us and sharing about your story and your research. We really appreciate it.
It was fun. I got to go through a lot of old pictures and sent some feelers out with my mom and dad. I was like, do we have any pictures of like me in a cave? Or that's what
way back into the childhood photos.
Like first slide ones were of like, I'm like, I know we went there. Are there pictures of it?
Awesome. Well, thank you again, and thank you everybody for joining us. I think we all had a really good time. Just a quick announcement, the Western Science Center, if you are an educator and you're looking for a way to host a virtual field trip with a museum, you can now do that with the Western Science Center. We just launched that on our website yesterday, so go ahead to westernsciencecenter.org if you're looking for a way to get some field trip experience for your students while they're at home. So take it away, Gabe.
Yeah, and on that, if you like this program or programs like our virtual tours at both the Alf Museum, Western Science Center, and you want to continue to support them, you can find links on how to do that in the description below. And as always, make sure you like and subscribe for all the fossil goodness we're bringing every week. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you next week when we have Zach Reed talking about Failing Forward, Paleo Perseverance, another great story I'm excited for. So, yeah, we'll see you all next week.